Beneath the manicured lawns of Vatican City, under a courtyard called the Cortile della Pina, there's a room that most of the 6 million people who visit the Vatican every year will never see. It sits 2 stories underground, behind reinforced doors, protected by climate control systems, fire suppression technology, and armed guards. Inside are 85 kilometers of shelving. That is enough shelf space to stretch from Rome to Naples. On those shelves sit 12 centuries of paper, parchment, wax, and ink. Popes have called it their private vault. Historians call it one of the greatest untapped resources in the world. For decades, the rest of us simply called it the Vatican Secret Archive. And that single word, secret, has fueled more rumors, more novels, more documentaries, and more late-night internet theories than almost any other institution on Earth. So, what is actually down there? Not the version from thriller novels, not the version passed around in comment sections claiming the Vatican is hiding alien skeletons or a lost gospel that rewrites Christianity overnight. The real version, the one built from official Vatican records, leaked historical accounts, and the testimony of the scholars who have actually walked through those reading rooms. Let's start with the name itself, because it is more revealing than people expect. For almost 400 years, this place was officially called the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican's Secret Archive. In October 2019, Pope Francis signed a decree changing that name to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. To outsiders, that looked like an admission. It looked like the Church was quietly trying to shed a name that had become an embarrassment. But the actual explanation is far less dramatic. In the Latin the Church has used for centuries, the word secretum did not mean hidden or classified the way it does in English today. It meant private, personal, set apart. It referred to documents that belonged to the Pope specifically, as distinct from the broader Vatican library, which had always been more open to scholars. Somewhere along the way, in the modern English-speaking world, secret archive stopped sounding like private collection and started sounding like classified vault. Pope Francis's decision to rename it was, according to the Vatican's own explanation, an attempt to correct that drift in meaning, not a confession that something sinister was being hidden. But here's the twist. Even after the name change, parts of this archive really are restricted, and understanding exactly which parts and why tells you far more about how the Vatican actually operates than any conspiracy theory does. The archive as we know it was formally established in 1612 by Pope Paul V. Before that, papal records had existed in scattered form for centuries, sometimes literally traveling with the Pope from city to city as the Church negotiated with kings, emperors, and rival factions across Europe. Paul V's decision was essentially bureaucratic. He wanted to centralize the paperwork of an institution that, by the early 17th century, functioned simultaneously as a religious authority, a diplomatic power, a land-holding sovereign state, and a court of law. Popes had been accumulating letters, treaties, financial ledgers, and legal records for hundreds of years before that, and Paul V simply built the vault to hold it all in one place, under his direct control. For roughly 250 years, that vault stayed almost completely closed. Only the Pope and a small number of trusted officials could access it. It was not a research library, it was the operational memory of a government, and like most governments throughout history, the Church did not see any reason to let outsiders browse its internal files. That changed in 1881 when Pope Leo III made the decision that transformed the archive from a private vault into what it largely is today, a functioning historical research center. Leo III opened the doors to qualified scholars, and historians from across Europe rushed in. It was, at the time, a startling move. A 400-year-old fortress of paperwork suddenly became one of the richest primary source collections available to historians anywhere in the world. That openness has continued, with limits, ever since. Today, the archive invites around 1,500 scholars a year. On any given day, no more than 60 researchers are allowed inside at once. Each of them can request only 5 documents at a time. To even get through the door, you cannot simply show up with curiosity and a notebook. You need a specialized academic degree, a formal letter of introduction from a recognized research institution, a clearly defined research project, and proof of your academic qualifications. Once inside, you're given a workstation in one of 4 reading rooms, and you work under the same quiet, controlled conditions you'd find in any elite national archive, the kind used for state papers in London, Paris, or Washington. So if scholars have had access since 1881, where does the mystery actually come from? It comes from a single, very deliberate rule the Vatican has followed for exactly a century now. Since 1924, the Pope has released archival material according to what's called access by pontificate. In simple terms, the Vatican does not open its files continuously as time passes. Instead, it opens them in large blocks, tied to the reign of a specific pope, once that block is judged appropriate to release. For most of the 20th century, that meant researchers could see material only up through 1922. Anything from 1922 onward relating to the personal affairs of cardinals was locked away entirely, no matter how much time had passed. Anything after 1939, the beginning of the pontificate of Pius XII, was closed to outside eyes for more than 80 years. That particular closure became the single most explosive chapter in the modern history of this archive, and it has nothing to do with aliens, secret gospels, or hidden treasure. It has to do with the Holocaust. Pope Pius XII led the Catholic Church through the entirety of the Second World War. His actions, and more specifically his public silence during the mass murder of European Jews, have been debated by historians for generations. Some scholars and church defenders argue that Pius worked quietly behind the scenes. Information had an obligation to speak plainly against genocide and did not. For decades, this argument was fought largely with second-hand accounts, diplomatic cables from other governments, and testimony from survivors and witnesses, because the one archive that could settle disputed details, the Vatican's own internal wartime records, remained sealed. That finally changed in March of 2020 when the Vatican opened the Pius XII archive to researchers. Pope Francis had announced the decision a year earlier, in a public statement that acknowledged, almost bluntly, that the Church was not afraid of history and that he expected the material to generate what he called appropriate criticism. That is a remarkably candid thing for an institution built on centuries of controlled messaging to say publicly, and scholars have taken him up on it. Since 2020, historians have been working through roughly 16 million pages of wartime documentation, correspondence, internal memos, appeals from Jewish families and organizations that reached the Vatican during the war, and the Pope's own private notes. The research is still ongoing, and it has already reshaped parts of the historical record, filling in gaps, confirming some defenses of Pius while undercutting others. This is, right now, in real time, one of the most significant ongoing historical investigations in the world, and it is happening because a supposedly secretive institution voluntarily opened its most sensitive 20th century files to outside scrutiny. Beyond Pius XII, there is still a hard wall. Everything after 1958 remains closed. Materials touching the private lives of cardinals from 1922 onward are still sealed, full stop, regardless of how many decades pass. The Vatican's justification mirrors the logic used by most national governments when they seal state records. Many of the people named in those files, or their immediate families, are still alive. Diplomatic cables can embarrass foreign governments still in existence. Internal church disciplinary records can affect the reputations of clergy or their relatives who are still living. This is the same reasoning behind Britain's 30-year rule for state papers, or the United States classification periods for sensitive government documents. It's bureaucratic caution dressed up, in the Vatican's case, in centuries of mystique. Now, let's actually go inside. Because what fills 85 kilometers of shelving is, frankly, stranger and more human than most of the myths give it credit for. This is not a room of glowing artifacts and forbidden knowledge. It is, more than anything, the largest continuous administrative paper trail on Earth. There are papal bulls, the formal decrees popes have issued for centuries. There are complete registers of papal correspondence going back to the reign of Innocent III at the start of the 13th century, meaning nearly 800 years of a single institution's letters have survived intact in one location. There are account books tracking church finances stretching back centuries, the kind of tedious ledger work that reveals more about how an institution actually functioned day to day than any dramatic decree ever could. There are trial records, diplomatic treaties, land grants, correspondence with kings, emperors, sultans, and eventually presidents and prime ministers. And scattered through those centuries of bureaucracy are documents that genuinely do read like something out of a historical thriller, except they're real, verified, and in many cases already studied and published by historians. Take the trial record of Galileo Galilei. The actual proceedings of the Roman Inquisition's investigation into Galileo, the astronomer forced to publicly recant his support for a sun-centered solar system in now, 1633, sit in this archive. Scholars have pored over these documents for generations, using them to reconstruct exactly how the Church's judicial process worked, what pressures were applied to Galileo, and how the verdict was reached. There is no ambiguity here, no legend. It is one of the best documented trials in early modern history. The paper trail survives, because the Church, for all its later embarrassment over the case, never destroyed the record. Then there's a document historians call the Chinon Parchment. For centuries, the Knights Templar, the powerful medieval military religious order, were the subject of one of history's most dramatic downfalls. In the early 1300s, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their mass arrest on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals. Under torture, many Templars confessed to bizarre crimes. The order was eventually dissolved by Pope Clement V in 1312, and for 7 centuries the Vatican's own position on the affair remained murky. partly because a key document had been misfiled in the wrong section of the archive. That document, the Chinon parchment, recorded the results of a secret papal investigation into the Templars' leadership in 1308. It showed that Pope Clement had actually absolved the Templar leadership of the charge of heresy, even as he bowed to political pressure and dissolved the order anyway. The parchment wasn't uncovered and correctly identified until 2001, misfiled among thousands of other documents for hundreds of years. When it surfaced, it didn't reveal a conspiracy. It revealed something almost more interesting. An institution that had, 7 centuries earlier, quietly reached one conclusion internally while publicly acting on another, entirely for political survival. There's also a formal petition connected to King Henry VIII of England, one of the documents most frequently mentioned by scholars who've worked in the archive. It relates to Henry's attempt to secure an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in the 1530s, the request that Pope Clement VII ultimately refused. A refusal that triggered England's break from the Catholic Church and the creation of the Church of England. The document is remarkable partly because of its sheer physical presence, a long parchment roll bearing dozens of wax seals from English nobles and clergy supporting Henry's case. It's a tangible artifact of one of the most consequential political and religious ruptures in European history, sitting in the very institution that rejected the request that caused it. These are the kinds of items that genuinely justify calling this archive extraordinary. Not because they hide impossible secrets, but because they are unbroken physical evidence of pivotal moments in world history, preserved with a level of continuity that almost no other institution on the planet can match. Most governments have been destroyed, conquered, or reorganized at some point over the last 1,000 years, and their records scattered or lost along with them. The Vatican, whatever else can be said about it, has maintained an unbroken administrative existence since the early medieval period, and it kept its paperwork the entire time. Now, let's talk about the myths directly, because they deserve a real answer rather than dismissal. The most persistent claim online is that the Vatican is hiding evidence of extraterrestrial contact, ancient astronauts, or some parallel history of humanity that would upend religion entirely. There is no credible evidence of this whatsoever, and it's worth understanding why the claim keeps circulating anyway. Part of it comes from the Vatican Observatory, a real publicly known scientific institution that studies astronomy, and has for over a century, including Jesuit priest astronomers, who have openly discussed the theological implications of potential extraterrestrial life in public interviews. That entirely legitimate, publicly available scientific curiosity gets twisted online into claims of secret contact evidence buried in a vault, which is a significant leap with zero documentary support. Another persistent claim involves suppressed gospels, lost books of the Bible that would supposedly rewrite Christian theology if released. It's true that many ancient texts exist outside the accepted biblical canon, gospels attributed to Thomas, Judas, Mary Magdalene, and others, mostly recovered through actual archaeological discoveries like the Nag Hammadi find in Egypt in 1945, not from the Vatican's own vault. These texts aren't secret. They've been translated, published, sold in bookstores, and studied in university religious studies departments for decades. The Vatican didn't suppress them. Early church councils, centuries before the Vatican Archive even existed, debated and excluded them from the canon through theological arguments that are themselves well-documented history, not secret decisions made behind locked doors in Rome. A third claim involves the idea of some kind of financial or political blackmail material, secret files on world leaders that the church supposedly uses for leverage. This one is harder to definitively disprove simply because it's an unfalsifiable claim by design, but there's no credible documentation supporting it, and it runs against the actual observable pattern of how the archive has behaved, which is slow, bureaucratic, cautious, and occasionally willing to open even its most reputationally damaging material, as we saw with the Pius XII files. The honest answer is that the real archive is more interesting than the myth, precisely because it's true. It's the paper memory of an institution that has directly shaped European and world history for over 1,000 years. Wars, marriages, scientific persecution, religious schisms, diplomatic betrayals, all recorded in real time by the people who were making those decisions. The mystery isn't a hidden truth waiting behind a locked door. The mystery is what more we'll learn as pontificate after pontificate slowly gets unlocked decade by decade, the same deliberate way it always has. The Vatican is also, somewhat surprisingly for an institution built on ancient tradition, actively working to digitize this entire collection. Early in the 21st century, the archive began converting its physical holdings into digital images, partly to make research more accessible and partly out of necessity, since parchment and paper simply degrade over time no matter how carefully they're stored. By the last publicly reported figures, the archive held around 180 terabytes of digital storage and had already scanned more than 7 million individual images. That is an enormous undertaking. but it's still a tiny fraction of the estimated 16 million pages known to exist just within the Pius XII collection alone, let alone the full 12 centuries of material spread across 600 separate archival collections. To speed this up, the Vatican partnered with Roma Tre University in 2017 on a project called Encodus Ratio, which uses artificial intelligence and optical character recognition specifically trained to read medieval handwriting, a task that's far harder than it sounds, since handwriting styles, abbreviations, and even the Latin language itself shifted dramatically across the centuries these documents span. The goal is to eventually make searchable transcriptions of documents that right now can only be read by specialists trained specifically in paleography, the study of historical handwriting. If that project succeeds at scale, it could do more to genuinely open the archive to the wider world than any policy change ever could. Because most of the barrier isn't official secrecy, it's the sheer difficulty of physically reading 800-year-old Latin script. It's also worth understanding what the archive is not. It is not the same thing as the Vatican Library, even though the two sit near each other and are sometimes confused in casual conversation. The Vatican Apostolic Library, founded formally in the 15th century under Pope Nicholas V, holds books, printed volumes, and manuscripts meant for broader scholarly and even public-facing use, including tens of thousands of illuminated medieval manuscripts, some of which have already been digitized and are viewable online by anyone, not just credentialed researchers. The archive is different. It holds the actual working records of church governance, the internal memory of the institution itself, which is why its access rules are so much stricter. So why does the myth persist so powerfully, decades after the facts have been publicly available? Part of it is simple human psychology. Locked doors invite speculation, and an institution as old, as wealthy, and as historically consequential as the Catholic Church is an almost irresistible target for conspiracy narratives. Part of it is genuine, legitimate historical grievance, the very real and very documented instances where the Church did suppress inconvenient information, did protect its own reputation over transparency, particularly around cases like the clergy sex abuse scandals, where internal church records have in fact been used to shield wrongdoing for decades in various dioceses around the world, a documented and serious pattern that has nothing to do with the historical archive in Rome specifically, but understandably deepens public suspicion of Vatican secrecy in general. And part of the myth's staying power is just good storytelling. A locked vault under one of the most recognizable religious institutions on earth, holding 1,000 years of secrets, is a compelling premise whether or not it's accurate, which is exactly why novelists and filmmakers have used it as a backdrop for decades, blurring the line in the public imagination between the real bureaucratic vault and the fictional treasure room of thriller plots. The truth sitting underneath all of that noise is this. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is real, immense, and genuinely one of the most historically significant document collections on the planet. It holds unbroken records of an institution's decisions stretching back roughly 1,200 years, through the reigns of kings and empires that no longer exist. It has, at various points, been closed for reasons of raw political control, and later opened for reasons of scholarly access. In its most sensitive modern chapter, the conduct of the Church during the Holocaust is being actively investigated right now by historians working through millions of newly released pages. It contains verified physical evidence of some of history's most consequential trials and controversies, from Galileo's condemnation to the fall of the Templars to the rupture that created the Church of England. And it remains, even today, only partially open, sealed by a rule that has less to do with hiding forbidden knowledge and more to do with the same careful, decades-long caution that governments around the world apply to their own sensitive records. Let's slow down for a moment and picture what it's actually like to work inside this place, because the physical experience of the archive tells you as much as the documents themselves. A researcher who has cleared every hurdle, the degree, the letter of recommendation, the approved project, the background check, arrives at a nondescript entrance near St. Anne's Gate, one of the working entrances to Vatican City that tourists never see. There's no dramatic descent through torchlit corridors. There's a security check, a coat check, and a quiet reading room with modern desks, good lighting, and power outlets for laptops, not unlike a university special collections library anywhere else in the world. Researchers fill out request slips for up to 5 items a day, and then they wait, sometimes for hours, while archive staff retrieve the material from the stacks, some of which sit in that underground bunker beneath the Cortile della Pina, temperature and humidity controlled to protect parchment and paper that, in some cases, is nearing 1,000 years old. Once a document arrives, the work is often painfully slow. Many of the oldest materials are written in Latin, using medieval abbreviations and handwriting conventions that took scribes years to master and take modern scholars almost as long to learn to read fluently. A single page might take an entire afternoon to transcribe accurately. This is one of the least appreciated truths about the archive. It is not guarded primarily by armed men or classification stamps. It is guarded in practice by the sheer difficulty of reading what's inside it. That's part of why the Artificial Intelligence Transcription Project matters so much. It's attacking the archive's real barrier, not secrecy, but sheer illegibility to anyone without years of specialized training. There's also a human dimension to this place that rarely makes it into the conspiracy videos. The archive employs its own staff of professional archivists, conservators, and paleographers, many of whom have spent their entire careers working with a single narrow slice of the collection, one century, one pontificate, one type of document. Conservators spend months repairing individual damaged pages, stabilizing ink that's fading, rebinding volumes whose spines have cracked after centuries of use. It's slow, careful, unglamorous work, closer to museum conservation than espionage. The Vatican has also had to think hard about digital security, since the 7 million scanned images now sitting in its servers are, in their own way, just as valuable and just as vulnerable as the physical originals, meaning the archive's modern challenges look a lot like the challenges facing any major library or national archive. Funding, staffing, preservation, and cybersecurity, not secret rituals or hidden knowledge. Conservators spend months repairing individual damaged pages, stabilizing ink that's fading, rebinding volumes whose spines have cracked after centuries of use. It's slow, careful, unglamorous work, closer to museum conservation than espionage. The Vatican has also had to think hard about digital security, since the 7 million scanned images now sitting in its servers are, in their own way, just as valuable and just as vulnerable as the physical originals, meaning the archive's modern challenges look a lot like the challenges facing any major library or national archive. Funding, staffing, preservation, and cybersecurity, not secret rituals or hidden knowledge. ITSMs or provincial financial records may go decades without a single researcher requesting them, simply because no one has yet had a reason to look. In a strange way, that means the real unopened secrets of the Vatican archive aren't dramatic revelations being deliberately withheld. They're just ordinary history, sitting quietly on a shelf, waiting for someone with the right question to come looking for it. Consider, too, how this archive fits into the wider story of the Vatican as a political entity, not just a religious one. For centuries, the popes weren't only spiritual leaders, they governed actual territory, the papal states, stretching across a significant portion of central Italy until 1870. That means the archive isn't only a religious record. It's the administrative backbone of what was, for a very long time, a functioning European government, complete with tax records, legal disputes, land grants, and diplomatic negotiations with the other great powers of Europe's. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy at the end of the 18th century, he actually seized large portions of the Vatican archive and had them shipped to Paris, an episode that nearly scattered centuries of papal records across a foreign capital permanently. After Napoleon's fall, the material was eventually returned to Rome, though not without losses along the way, a reminder that this archive's survival to the present day was never guaranteed. It survived invasions, occupations, and the collapse of the papal states themselves, which makes its continuity across 12 centuries even more remarkable than it might first appear. There is no ancient astronaut evidence down there. There is no lost gospel that will unravel 2,000 years of Christian theology overnight. What there is something arguably more valuable to historians, an unbroken paper record of how one of the most powerful and enduring institutions in human history actually made its decisions. In its own words, written down in real time, century after century, waiting, slowly, pontificate by pontificate, to be read. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with longest. We tend to want our mysteries wrapped up in something supernatural, something that breaks the rules of the world we already understand. But the Vatican Archive suggests a different kind of mystery altogether, the ordinary grinding mystery of power itself. How does an institution survive for over 1,000 years? How does it decide what to reveal and what to withhold, and on what timeline? How does it weigh the demands of historical truth against the private reputations of people who are, in many cases, still alive today? Those are not questions with a single dramatic answer hidden on a shelf somewhere. They're questions the Vatican has been answering, slowly and imperfectly, pontificate by pontificate, for 400 years, and will likely keep answering for centuries more. The next major opening, whenever it comes, covering the decades from 1958 onward, will almost certainly reignite the same debate the Pius XII files did, forcing the Church to reckon publicly with decisions made privately, long ago, by men who never expected the world to be reading their letters. That, far more than any hidden gospel or buried secret, is what makes this archive worth paying attention to. Not what it's hiding, but what it will eventually be forced to reveal.